So first things first, I'm going to be totally honest to you guys. I got about 5 hours of sleep last night, so I might be stumbling a little bit on my words. Classic computer science combo. Go to sleep late, wake up early. We're going to see how it goes, but just want to let you all know, in case like I repeat myself or whatever a bunch of times, you already know. So, a couple of disclaimers. I'm going to be yapping a lot at the start to give you all time to download some dependencies. I understand a lot of you may come with some background experience on React, Next.JS, Node.js, JavaScript, whatever. But for any new people that might have not had that type of experience with Next.js or React, I want to, of course, give you time to like actually install stuff that they need. When you use dependencies, a GitHub account, you guys probably already have a GitHub account, your classes or do a personal project work. But we're going to be taking advantage of some of GitHub's, like basically we're going to be taking advantage of like GitHub repository if we have the time, and we're going to go ahead and upload our GitHub repository with our Next.js project to Vercel. And then another thing we're going to do, which a lot of you probably already have, is the Node.js runtime. Look up Node.js on your search bar on your browser. It's going to be the first site that pops up. And even if you already have it installed, if you haven't updated to at least version 18.17, which is the minimum version required in order to run the latest version of Next, I'm going to go ahead and ask you guys if you can please update that. Because I remember when I like updated my own personal project to like the latest version of Next, everything started breaking because I didn't have like at least that version installed. So definitely check that out, like do Node version on your terminal or whatever. Make sure that you have the right version if you want to follow along. And of course, Vercel account, totally optional. We might not even get to this part of the meeting, being totally honest, because I don't want to keep you guys too long. But if we do get to the part, it's going to be pretty easy. It's pretty much like a 2-click process, and then you have your Next.js. Then you have your Next.js app up on the cloud. But of course, if you want to get started doing that, you can set up a Vercel account before we get into the actual coding portion. Another disclaimer, this is just an introduction to the framework. I'm not going to lie, I'm not a React guru. Very misleading appearance. I may look like your average React guru on YouTube, but I'm not. I have played around with Next.js, and of course, this is a very relatively short meeting, whereas many Next.js introduction and Next.js YouTube videos are part of a series where each video is 1 hour long and there's 80 videos. So there's only so much that we can cover. I'm going to try and cover the fundamentals in order for you to get started in making apps and using Next.js. But yes, don't expect to be like the ultimate Next.js GOAT in terms of like development, like literally pop in, build Twitch, like 1 hour and then make millions, okay? And of course, another thing, I love Next.js. I like using it, but it's not perfect. Everybody has their own preferences. Everybody has their own framework that they enjoy doing work in. Jonas was talking about this in the past couple of meetings, keep it simple, stupid. Use what works for you. Don't be tied to a specific framework just because it's like trendy or anything. There's like 1 bajillion JavaScript frameworks coming out every day. So who knows, maybe in a couple of days, Next.js literally might not be relevant anymore, So hopefully this presentation is going to remain a useful resource for more than a week. If not, if it doesn't, there's an uncountably infinite amount of JavaScript frameworks coming out every day. So of course we try to adapt, we try to go on to the next framework, but in the end, you have to use what you're most comfortable with, right? And like, if you don't like frameworks, just go back to like vanilla JS, HTML, CSS, how we used to do it. It works just fine for pretty much everybody. And it's the God-given way of like actually making web applications. So going into the meat and potatoes of the subject, we're gonna go ahead and look at Next.js. It is a full stack React-based development framework. It draws a lot from React, the library, right? All of its patterns are modeled after React, but it adds the capability of server-side rendering, as well as client-side rendering, static rendering, whatever you want, right? It uses React for building UIs, and it adds extended features like API endpoints. It adds image optimization, font optimization, and a bunch of other stuff. Just to go over some of the features, file-based routing, right? We use the file tree in our application to decide like the locations of like our URLs and what gets presented at each of those URLs. And we're going to be talking about this a little bit more later. It offers server-side rendering with client-side hydration, which we're going to talk about a little bit later as well. It extends data fetching and caching, which this is kind of a new feature of Next.js with like the recent app router. We might not have time to like cover it completely, but definitely something to look out for and something that the team behind Next.js is actively working on. And styling, there's a bunch of like support for different types of styling, CSS and JS, Tailwind, modular, CSS. There's a bunch of optimizations, and of course it has TypeScript support if you're a big enjoyer of TypeScript. So Next.js is made by Vercel, which is a cloud hosting platform specializing in these types of applications, specifically Jamstack applications that use some degree of static generation and server-side rendering. And it's super popular right now. Like if you look at it on GitHub, right now it has upwards of 117,000 stars last I checked, and it's literally used by like everybody in the universe. Like everybody's making a YouTube tutorial on how to build stuff that's already been built, but in Next.js. And these are really useful for somebody going into the web development field. If you're like just been introduced to web development and you want to start learning React and you got a good hold of React, Next.js seems to be the next logical step for many people, right? Because there's so much content available online that is like really good, high quality, and it contains literally an end-to-end explanation of the framework and how to use it best, right? But how did it actually get so popular, right? Why are we using Next.js over something else like Gatsby or Hugo or whatever other framework that exists, right? For that, we actually have to go back to kind of like the mid-2010s. And this slide is kind of a lie because right after I said before the mid-2010s, specifically, we're going to have to go back to the era of the browser wars, which was happening kind of like late 2000s, early 2010s. A bunch of browsers were fighting for dominance in the market share of like people. You had like Opera, Internet Explorer, Google Chrome. Everybody was coming out with new features for client-side JavaScript to support cooler web applications, and everybody was doing a different thing. And it resulted in a lot of difficulty in terms of client-side scripting with JavaScript, right? Like on the web page itself, after you've received the server-side rendered web page, you want to do some stuff with JavaScript, but it's like basically impossible because every browser is not cross-compatible during that time. Everybody's doing their own thing. And some browsers are capable of things that others aren't, right? Like, for example, like some browsers actually had the ability to send the keyword event, right, with the key code on a key down event, right? If somebody presses a key, it sends the key code with it, while some other browsers, you couldn't do that. You kind of had to like infer through other means instead of like the function or like the event handler parameters, right? So it was a really big pain to a lot of JavaScript developers at the time. And because of that, jQuery was created, right? That was the primary purpose for jQuery, was to provide a standardized interface to address browser compatibility issues. It was an imperative library for client-side. Yeah, what's up? That's actually I was like looking up like jQuery images, and I found like this was the first thing that popped up on like my search results when I think I was like searching via like between 2017 and 2018, and this guy popped up, and I was like, wow, this is perfect. This is like perfectly encompasses because it was a hero. And of course, like people don't use jQuery right now, but everybody and their mother was using jQuery back then, right? Because it was a really useful tool in a time when browser compatibility was a big issue, right? There were so many different browsers coming out with all different types of native functions that you could use, and it was really hard to build something that was cross-compatible without using a library like this one, right? Provided a uniform interface across different browsers, and it's still widely used today. Comes with WordPress like straight out of the box. Like if you've ever worked in like WordPress plugin development, you might have had to deal with like PHP and of course a bunch of jQuery for all the stuff that happens on the client side. So there's still a lot of jQuery developers out there. But something happened where in 2013, Facebook open sourced their React library, right? And it started growing in popularity until eventually becoming mainstream around 2016-ish. And a lot of people really liked it because it was a very powerful component-based API way of building really rich interactive user interfaces, right? It had stuff like hooks, state management, reactivity, and it also had a really quick way of like getting up and ready with a React app without having to deal with like the complexities of Webpack and Babel. And it was like npx create React app. You guys might have used that, and you guys might have read a couple of articles of why it's so bad and stuff. At the time, it was like revolutionary, right? Because if not, you had to go through like setup hell, literally, to set up your Webpack configuration and set up Babel to like transpile and bundle your JavaScript. And it was like a whole total issue around 2013 until in 2014, eventually Create React app came out. And you know, it was really cool. A lot of people started adopting it. They were like, oh my God, like React is awesome. Let's make like 20 bajillion YouTube videos about it. And you know, it became pretty much the library of choice today. It's one of the most popular libraries in the world right now, and it's been that way for about like what, 7 years. And with React came the rise of the single page application, right? Going back to that Create React app example, Create React app being the primary way for users being introduced to React for for them to build their apps. This was the primary way of building them, right? A new React user might not set up their own Webpack and Babel configuration. They might just do npx create React app and build their whole app that way, right? And that was confined to client-side rendering. And specifically, it was based on an architectural pattern, which is the single page application, right? So the way that the single page application works is that basically you have a bunch of React, and that all eventually gets compiled into a series of JavaScript, HTML, CSS documents, all of them being sent to the client, right? And the way that it got sent, essentially, just because of the nature of how React worked at the time, right? You would send a bare bones HTML page with probably like literally nothing. It just says you need JavaScript to like use this web page. And it would have links to the JavaScript and CSS files that you need in order to actually run the application, right? You would have CSS files. It could be like in the actual HTML document, like CSS, or if you're using like CSS and JS, or depending on like your configuration, you might be sending that like later after the document has already been sent. And of course, you had your JavaScript files, which handle depending additional HTML to the page based on your React code. And also state management, like use state, set state, stuff like that, use effect, all the different hooks. And it also managed stuff like client-side routing. If you ever worked with React Router DOM for some time, that's what handles like your transitions on the client side rather than on the server side, switching between different views and all of that, right? So essentially, where the client-side rendering works, we send a request to the server, and then boom, bare bones HTML response with a bunch of meta tags and JS and CSS script tags. From there, yeah, as you can see here, we have like the script and then the link to the CSS. And what happens is that after we receive that HTML document, we send another request to the server. We're like, okay, where's my JS? Where's my CSS? Let's get that right now. So we retrieve the JS and CSS, and then we receive it, and it's on our client machine. And then from there, we have to run the JavaScript in order to render the page, fetch any dynamic data, and then set up additional libraries, client-side routing, whatever. And then eventually, your page will fully render, and it will be interactable, and it will be like really awesome, right? Awesome React app that you built. And this was pretty good at the time. Like everybody was pretty happy with this pattern. You know, it was a really easy way of building super rich interactive applications. It was really smooth. That's why they called it like the web app, right? If you had client-side transitions, if you've ever done that, you'll notice that it's like really quick. You don't have to go to the server to do a full page refresh to ask for the next page on your browser, right? You already have all the JavaScript downloaded for that specific like view of markup. So all you got to do is run the JavaScript to open up the page. It was really snappy and responsive. And it also had a vibrant ecosystem of third-party packages, and this is in part of like the rise. This is in part due to the rise in popularity of the library. And also, this is kind of like, honestly, I pulled this one out of my ass because it's not really like a specific like advantage of React, but you also had a decoupled front end and back end, which meant that, you know, if you wanted to scale your back end because, for example, you had a mobile app now built in something else like React Native or whatever, right? You didn't have to like scale your front end. It was already decoupled because it's its own set of like HTML, CSS, and JS documents that you could serve through a content distribution network, whatever. You can just scale your backend independently and not have to worry about that. So it was pretty cool. But it was only really cool when you used it correctly. It was really easy to shoot yourself in the foot when making a single page application for the wrong purposes. For example, single page applications traditionally are kind of lacking in first contentful paint and first meaningful paint core vitals. And this kind of goes back to the rendering pattern, right? You have to do 2 round trip fetches at least to actually get the full content of your page before even being able to run the JavaScript to render the page, right? Like we were talking about how like you get the HTML document and then from there you get the JS and CSS, and then you eventually get the JS and CSS to your client machine, and then you have to run it. This actually caused like pretty significant delay depending on the weight of your application. For smaller applications, it's not much of a problem, especially if your computer could handle it and you had like decent bandwidth. But for computers with lower specs, worse internet, it was kind of difficult, and it could cause like longer wait times until you actually see something on the screen, right? This movie's not showing. It was pretty cool. So SEO might be difficult for certain use cases. Now, you might be calling me out right now being like, oh my God, Angel, you don't know what you're talking about. I was a developer back in 2015. And I remember when the Google Webmasters tools announced that they were able to crawl JavaScript, which meant that they were able to crawl React applications and get all the meta tags necessary to make my page awesome, SEO, like super search engine optimized. And I would be like, yeah, you're probably right. Like I was playing Overwatch around that time. So I wasn't actually super into web development, and I myself did not build a React application during that time. However, there is a lot of user testing that has been done by independent developers to show that these results were not really consistent, right? Google did announce that they could crawl JS back in 2015, but depending on like the libraries and the weight of your application, for example, some people had trouble with React Router DOM when trying to render the metadata for certain pages. Like if you had a blog app for some reason in React, the metadata for that would be really hard to achieve because it's going to be mixed together between different views, right? And there's a lot of state management on the client side. This is kind of a given, right? You have to keep track of the state of the server and the state of the client at the same time when you have something that's completely decoupled from the server. One good example is protected routes, right? I don't know if any of you implemented protected routing in React with something like React Router DOM, but essentially you have to prevent users from going into parts of your app where unauthenticated users shouldn't be accessing, right? And since the whole React app gets sent to your user, technically, unless you protect it with some sort of JavaScript mechanism, they could just go to like admin dashboard without logging in, right? You need to have a way to check the current state of authentication of your user on the client side against the server side state as well to be able to tell whether or not they should be routed to that page or not. And yeah, these problems could be addressed if you were a good enough React developer, right? You could like make your own awesome Webpack configuration, Node.js, hybridized server-side rendering approach, you know, post a 15-page log rocket article on how to do it and have others do the same. But it wasn't super easy, right? And a lot of people were left kind of like wanting from the previous approach, which was mainly like static site generation, server-side rendering, stuff with like PHP, which had been like the standard for ages until React took over and a lot of new developers were doing React development on the client side, right? And some people like asked themselves, well, what if we could do both, right? And then in October 2016, Next.JS, which was created by Vercel, was open sourced. And they essentially come to be a small framework for server-rendered universal applications. Universal applications basically means combining client-side rendering and server-side rendering, and you can choose between them depending on your use case. And, you know, it really popped off. It was really nice. A lot of people started adopting it. And, you know, part of what helped was essentially that, you know, Vercel was a company and Vercel had a pretty decent team supporting Next.js. And they actually went through 4 funding rounds, right? Like of like investing in capital for them to like be able to host their platform. And eventually they ended up like earning $313 million US, which is actually kind of insane. And of course, it makes sense now. If they have $313 million, they have more than enough money for marketing and dev relations and all types of support to be able to like expand on the framework and add stuff that people want in the framework. And yeah, and that's pretty much short history of Next.js. Now we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the framework specifics. So Next.js right now has 2 main routers, right? Has the pages router, which is like the old one that's still in use and has a lot of support still by the Next.js team. And there's also the app router, which is like the newer one. The main difference between the two is that if you set up a Next.js app, you're going to notice that the pages router primarily has all of like the UI files and route files in a pages directory. The new one has all of that in an app directory, right? It's going to be prepended by app. And then from there, you're going to have the rest of your file-based routing layout. And there's also a couple of like specific differences between the two. Like certain capabilities are available in Pages Router, certain capabilities are not available in Pages Router and available in App Router. So really depends on your own preference and what you're most comfortable building. We're going to be using the App Router, which honestly, like a lot of people hate the App Router right now because a lot of people say it's been a buggy mess for a little bit. The Next.js team is actively working on it. Honestly, I kind of like sympathize with that because I myself was a big user of like the Pages Router. But recently I tried learning the App Router and I thought it was like, pretty nice. So we're going to go ahead and do the App Router probably because it's the most future proof and it's probably going to get the most support from now on. So initial setup of the Next.js application is super simple. Just npx create next app at latest. This is assuming you already have Node.js installed and all that. And then it's going to ask you a couple of things like what is your project name, types, whether you want to use TypeScript, ESLint. And you can select these on your own kind of like basis. I'm probably, if we actually do the demo, if we have time to do the demo, I'm probably going to do no TypeScript, but you can do TypeScript if you want, totally support that. I'm going to do ESLint, Tailwind CSS. I'm going to add the source directory and then the app router as well. And I'm not going to customize the import alias, which if you don't know what the import alias is, it's just like it's kind of like a symbol pretty much used to signify kind of like the root of your app, right? So instead of importing like an absolute import, you might have a relative import based on this import alias. So, oh yeah, and this is just going over what I just explained, whether you want to install dependencies and then, CDing into your app once it's already installed. So some of the fundamentals of routing in Next.js, it uses a file-based routing system where the path of the URL that you are going to is determined by the folder structure. So the folders denote the URL path or like the route segment, and the files describe what the URL path actually is, whether it's a page, whether it's an endpoint, or whether it's like a layout for a series of pages that are children of that route, right? Layout.jsx and page.jsx are the main ones to care about for UI specifically. And then route.jsx, or like it can be JS or TS, depending on what you use, is going to be for your server-side API endpoints. Layout.jsx is exactly what it sounds like. Wraps around your pages or any children of like the route segment that you're in, and it's going to provide a common UI for all of them. And it's really helpful for like reusable stuff. Like as you can see here, for example, if we're making a dashboard, ideally on the layout of the dashboard, something that's going to be consistent through all the different pages might be the nav bar, the sidebar, and then you might want to have all of your child pages, like whether you have a finance dashboard, right? Or an employee dashboard, all of those would kind of be your children. And what happens is that the actual children get passed as a children prop in the dashboard layout function, and you can just go ahead and put that wherever you want to render it. And then this is like an example of like a dashboard. Say that you have a layout in your app/admin folder, then all of these routes are going to be wrapped by this layout, which provides a sidebar. So it's super easy. The page.js file is going to be your actual page UI. So it's almost like creating a regular React component, except you need to choose between like client components or server components. And we're actually going to go over a little bit of what client components and server components mean. Because it seems like really easy to tell like client-side rendering versus server-side rendering, but in the recent updates, there's actually a little bit of more nuance to it. So client components, these, despite the name, may be pre-rendered on the server, right? On full page load specifically. So when you first go into your Next.js app, that's going to trigger a full page load where Next.js is basically going to send you the HTML document and as much as possible of your application. But the difference between using like a Create React app application and a Next.js application is that Next.js is going to use React's API to attempt to pre-render your initial HTML for the page that you're traveling to on the server and then caching that for whenever you have to retrieve it, right? So it's going to send the initial HTML with already a couple of things that have been statically generated from your initial layout to your app, and then it's going to send the rest of the JavaScript for like React interactivity on the client side. Also, oh my gosh, sorry, I had a brain fart. Yeah, so when you actually navigate between pages, not on like a full page load refresh basis, but if you actually like click links to another page, say that you're in the home page and you see a link to the about page, for example, when you click on that using the Next.js link component, it attempts to perform a client-side navigation, which feels really snappy and very reminiscent of client-side rendering. And it uses kind of like a hybridized mix of, checking the VDOM to see like what needs to be changed based on this route change, and then performing as much of a client-side navigation as possible to make it feel really smooth, right? And they're also able to act on the client. So this is a key difference between client components and server components. You can have hooks on client components. You can have on-click event handlers, event listeners on your client components, but you can't have them in server components, right? And also, obviously, access to browser APIs and local storage, whatever, because at this point, it just lives on the client, right? Something big about this, client components are opt-in. Next.js prefers you to do server-side components. Unless you put a use client directive at the top, Next.js is going to think you're dealing with server components. And another thing to note is that when you put use client on the top of your, for example, like a layout.jsx, everything that's a child of that layout, so any subsequent routes, are going to be turned into client components. So you have to think really carefully about where you're putting your use client directives. Of course, the recommended pattern is to put it in the leaves of your application. So at the bottom layer, like at the very bottom, at the point of interactivity, that's where you're going to want to add use client. Like say that you have a bigger page with just one button, you want to put that use client directive in that button that manages that client side state, right? It's like that way you're able to actually like fetch on the server if you need to on multiple different places, and just have that interactivity restricted to that specific client side component, right? Now, oh no, I'm so sorry, guys. This animation did not work out. So server components are mostly pre-rendered on the server, whereas client-side components can be statically pre-rendered on the server. These ones are 99% pre-rendered on the server, right? And these ones actually have access to server-side functionality. Oh, this was a really cool code snippet that was on there. These ones actually have access to server-side functionality. So if you want to use like a Supabase function or something, you can use that on a server component, right? And you can directly literally grab from that Supabase database or like whatever database you have and literally inject that data onto your React component. And then that will be pre-rendered on the server and passed to the client as like a pre-rendered HTML document with a little bit of JavaScript for the React to take over for any client-side components, right? Now, a side note about both client and server components is that they both need something called hydration. They get hydrated on the client side, not on the server side. And specifically, hydration essentially means it's the process of using client-side JavaScript to add application state and interactivity to server-rendered HTML. If you don't know already, React uses something called a virtual DOM, virtual document object model, which is an in-memory representation of the state of your React application, right? In typical React applications, you literally render the whole application from the bottom up from an empty HTML template. So your virtual DOM is perfect from the start, right? It's already like in your JavaScript, you know everything that's on the page already. There's nothing in the HTML shell that you gave to the client before that. But in the case of pre-rendering, it kind of messes that up because you're already providing HTML on the client. And some client components and server components might be interleaved with each other. And for that, when you pass your React JavaScript to the client, it needs to be aware of these already existing HTML components to properly manage the DOM, right? And then here's an example of like the VDOMs like process and stuff. And so hydration process, if you're pre-rendering your HTML on the server side, and then you send that, that's the first thing that's going to be sent to your client. It's just going to be regular old HTML, right? Assuming you have just like a page with your name on it, and then you have a client component with a button, Next.js is first off going to send that page with your name on it. And then the button's going to be handled after, right? Starts off as regular HTML. And then after, you're going to go ahead and retrieve your JS and CSS. Once your JavaScript is retrieved, React is going to start running, and it's going to start the hydration process, right? And essentially, the hydration process is going to try and cross-compare between what you have on the HTML document right now and what React is to render on that HTML document, and mix that into its own understanding of the VDOM in memory, And then once it's properly like hydrated and soaked up, client-side interaction is going to be allowed. You're going to be able to like do pretty much anything on that page, and you're going to have no problems whatsoever. Now, why does, just in case you guys weren't paying attention, why does this matter? So pre-rendering can help achieve faster first contentful paint, first meaningful paint. I think I kind of like, I don't think I mentioned this, but I did mention that it's a disadvantage of like client-side render applications where FCP and FMP might be lacking due to the fact that it takes so long to render something on page. When you pre-render your HTML, that's immediately going to be sent to the client and they're immediately going to have something on screen. For example, if like not even just for a client, but for a web crawler, a Google web crawler, when they get your HTML document, they no longer have to wait for any additional fetch requests to have some data on screen to crawl. So your FCP and FMP scores are going to go up. However, when you add hydration to the mix, this can slightly delay the time to interactivity metric. And by time to interactivity metric, I mean the fact that your React is not going to let you interact with the application until it's done hydrating, right? So you get your HTML document from the server. It's all fine and dandy. You have UI on your screen. It's really nice. You got it really fast. So the UI popped up super fast on the screen. But if you try clicking on it or try interacting with it before React is done hydrating, you're not going to be able to. And this isn't really that big of a problem in modern systems because like networks are pretty fast. So React can probably like, and also computers are pretty fast. So React can finish hydrating well before you try clicking on the page. But for web crawlers, they're going to try clicking on your page a bunch of times, and until React is done hydrating, it's not going to work. And here's like a really nice yeah, what's up? Oh, I missed it. Oh my gosh. Actually, I was thinking about it. I was thinking about what from TikTok I should add. And for some reason, I couldn't find a good cutting soap GIF on Tenor. So I just had to add the Subway Surfers GIF. But yeah, as I was saying, right, like this is a really good example that shows kind of like the actual overhead burden of hydration, right? Like you get your HTML page super fast, you see UI on your screen super fast, and you probably will get your CSS super fast as well. But until that JavaScript is done downloading, parsing your existing HTML, executing, and then setting up all your event handlers and listeners, you're not going to be able to interact with it. And from the perspective of a human, it's not that big of a deal. But from the perspective of like a web crawler bot from Google or any other search engine, they're going to be like, dang, this is like taking forever, you know? Now, we already went through hydration. Now we can go ahead and go into API routes. So API routes are a feature of Next.js, just like we were mentioning how you can have UI through page.js and layout.js. You can also have a route.js in which you can create route handlers for all of the main HTTP methods. And it's really simple. All you got to do is export an asynchronous function with the name of the HTTP method. And there you can have your API route logic and return a response. You can return pretty much any type of response. Is very similar to Express, but more like a Lambda functioning system where you can have a set of functions for like a GET request. You can have one for a post. You can have one for a delete. You can have one all in the same file. One disclaimer is that obviously you can't have a page and a route.js that handles a GET request on the same section because they're going to conflict with each other, right? The GET request is either supposed to like return your API response or your page. So definitely don't try to do that. And then another thing that Next.js does is navigation. Of course, you can do like regular navigation throughout your app with anchor tags, but you can also use the Next.js link component to navigate between different sections of your app. And this component is pretty cool because it actually does some prefetching. On development servers, you don't see it, but in production servers, you're actually able to see that when you hover over your link, it's actually going to attempt to prefetch the page in order to load it faster before you click on it, right? And it also has a bunch of additional like optional parameters that you can add, but the core parameters are basically giving the href just like an anchor tag, and you can use relative routes as well for linking between different places in your Next.js app. And also you can do it programmatically. For example, there's the use router hook, which you can call to programmatically do route refreshes, soft refreshes, pushing to different routes and redirecting to different routes, both on the client and on the server side. And yeah, I don't know why that style was like that, actually. How much time do we have? Dang. What do you guys think? Should we try and go into the coding portion? Is that something you guys are interested in, or? Yeah? Okay, cool. Well, you guys can talk among yourselves. I'm gonna go ahead and set up my computer for this. And yes, we will get into it in a bit. And also, this picture is kind of like what we're gonna be trying to make. We might not have enough time for it, so we might just end up making something like the homepage. And then what projects and about can be done later. What's up? Yeah, so that's a good point. That's a good point. Another thing that you have to be worried about, and also I didn't mention this, but like the reason why we brought up like hydration and the implications on performance is because you have to kind of like evaluate these things to really understand the pros and cons of the framework. And what Sebastian brought up just now is another really good point. There are hydration errors that occur specifically due to hydration mismatches between what the server expects and what the client actually has, right? And that can happen pretty easily. There's actually a dedicated page on the Next.js documentation that explains some of the reasons why it might happen, but many times it happens for very, very, very non-obvious reasons, like third-party dependencies that you install that don't play nicely with the Next.js framework. And it's something that you have to be like super aware about, be very careful about like setting up your server versus client boundaries, what's running on the server versus what's running on the client. And it's another reason why you might have to like, evaluate like the pros and cons of the framework to see if it's right for you. Does that kind of like answer the question? Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, those are not nice, man. Those are. Yeah, I usually just like randomly walk towards those. No, for real. I just kind of like wait. There's like nothing you can do, literally. I think the most effective stuff you need. Um, I think- let me join the Zoom meeting and then I'll share my screen. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Guys, so we do have a quick announcement while we wait for a demo to be set up. Hello? Was it this mic that was on the whole time?
Oh no, no.
Oh no. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me through that? No, the mic's coming through. Okay, yeah, we just turned it down. All right, to whoever's watching this workshop in the future on YouTube, I hope you enjoy that humiliation we just had. Okay, everyone, if any of you are interested in running for the position of involvement officer, that's basically our social chair. If you want to help plan SSD socials, that position is still open, but we are talking to someone who's interested in it. Right now, it's first come, first serve. So if you're interested in that role, be sure to talk to an officer. Time might be running out. All that person does is they basically plan a few socials that we do each semester.